The Russia-Ukraine war has now reached a point where the question is no longer just who is winning, but whether the war itself is slowly transforming into something else. As 2026 begins, the conflict has entered a phase that looks very different from the dramatic early days of 2022, yet remains just as dangerous, just as costly, and just as uncertain. Many people around the world are asking the same question. Is this the endgame of the war, or just another long chapter in a conflict that refuses to end? To understand where the war stands today, we need to step back and look at how the nature of the fighting has changed. In the early years, the war was defined by rapid advances, dramatic counteroffensives, and global shock. Cities fell, territories changed hands, and headlines were dominated by maps showing red and blue arrows moving across Ukraine. Today, those arrows move far less. Front lines shift slowly, sometimes by only a few hundred meters, but the fighting itself has not stopped. Instead, the war has become one of endurance, resources, and political will. On the battlefield, the most visible change is the rise of drone warfare. Drones are now central to almost every military operation on both sides. Ukraine has increasingly used long-range drones to strike deep inside Russian territory, including targets near major cities, fuel depots, military bases, and transportation hubs. These attacks are not designed to capture territory, but to disrupt Russia's ability to sustain the war. They also serve a psychological purpose, reminding Russian civilians that the war is not distant and cannot be fully contained at the front lines. Russia, meanwhile, continues to rely heavily on missile strikes, glide bombs, and artillery to pressure Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Energy facilities, industrial zones, and transport networks remain frequent targets. This strategy aims to weaken Ukraine's economy, strain its air defenses, and exhaust the population over time. Winter periods are especially critical, as attacks on power and heating systems can create humanitarian pressure and force the Ukrainian government to divert resources from the battlefield. Despite these attacks, neither side has achieved a decisive breakthrough. Russia has gained some territory since late 2024, but not enough to claim victory. Ukraine has defended key areas and inflicted significant losses, but has not been able to fully reclaim occupied regions. This balance of limited gains and heavy losses is what defines the current phase of the war. Another major factor shaping the conflict is manpower. Both Russia and Ukraine face serious challenges in sustaining troop levels. Ukraine, with a smaller population, has been under intense pressure to manage mobilization while maintaining economic and social stability. Russia, although larger, also faces recruitment problems, relying increasingly on incentives, contract soldiers, and regional quotas. Casualties on both sides are high, even if exact numbers remain disputed and politically sensitive. As the fighting drags on, the war has also become deeply tied to domestic politics. In Ukraine, the government faces the difficult task of keeping public morale high while acknowledging the reality that the war may not end quickly. Support for resistance remains strong, but fatigue is real. Families have lived under air raid sirens for years, businesses operate under constant uncertainty, and millions remain displaced internally or abroad. In Russia, the situation is more complex. State media continues to frame the war as a defensive and necessary operation, but cracks are visible. Economic pressure, rising prices, and the steady flow of casualties have affected public sentiment. While open opposition remains limited, expectations among ordinary Russians have begun to shift. Many no longer talk about total victory but about when and how the war might finally end. Internationally, the war has become a test of long-term commitment. Western countries continue to support Ukraine with military aid, financial assistance, and diplomatic backing. However, this support is no longer automatic or unlimited. Political debates in Europe and the United States increasingly focus on costs, priorities, and the risk of escalation. Elections, budget pressures, and global crises elsewhere compete for attention. This does not mean support for Ukraine has collapsed, but it does mean that Kyiv must constantly justify its needs and adapt to changing political realities. Advanced weapons systems, air defense missiles, and financial aid remain crucial, but deliveries are slower and more carefully negotiated than in the early years of the war. At the same time, Russia has adapted to sanctions more effectively than many expected. Although its economy has suffered, it has not collapsed. Trade has been redirected, domestic production has increased in some sectors, and the state has prioritized military spending. This adaptation allows Russia to continue fighting, even if at a high long-term cost. This brings us to diplomacy. Peace talks have never fully disappeared, but they have remained fragile and indirect. Back-channel discussions, mediation attempts by neutral countries, and quiet negotiations have taken place alongside active fighting. However, the core problem remains unchanged. The fundamental demands of both sides are incompatible. Ukraine insists on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security guarantees. Any settlement that freezes the conflict while leaving occupied territories under Russian control is seen as unacceptable by Kyiv, as it would reward aggression and leave the country vulnerable to future attacks. Russia, on the other hand, seeks recognition of its territorial gains and security arrangements that limit Ukraine's military alignment with the West. These positions create a deadlock. Neither side wants to be seen as conceding too much, especially after years of sacrifice. This is why many analysts now believe that the most likely outcome is not a clear peace treaty, but a prolonged period of reduced intensity fighting, punctuated by negotiations, ceasefires, and occasional escalations. In this sense, the idea of an endgame needs to be redefined. In popular imagination, an endgame is a final battle or a dramatic peace agreement that ends everything at once. In reality, modern wars between states often end slowly, through exhaustion, political shifts, and gradual compromises. The Russia-Ukraine war appears to be moving in that direction, but it is not there yet. Another important element is the global impact of the war. Energy markets, food prices, and international security have all been affected. Although the initial shock to global markets has eased, the long-term consequences remain. Countries have adjusted supply chains, increased defense spending, and reconsidered alliances. NATO has expanded and strengthened its eastern presence, while non-aligned countries carefully balance their relations with both Russia and the West. The war has also influenced military thinking worldwide. The widespread use of drones, electronic warfare, and precision strikes has changed how armies prepare for future conflicts. Lessons learned in Ukraine are being studied closely by military planners around the world, making this war not just a regional conflict, but a global reference point. So, is this the endgame? The honest answer is that the war is not ending soon, but it is changing form. The phase of rapid movement and dramatic offensives has largely passed. What we see now is a grinding struggle where time itself is a weapon. Each side hopes that the other will eventually tire, lose support, or face internal pressure strong enough to force compromise. For Ukraine, the challenge is to survive and maintain international support long enough to secure a settlement that preserves its independence and future security. For Russia, the challenge is to sustain the war without triggering deeper economic or political instability at home. For the rest of the world, the challenge is to manage the consequences while preventing the conflict from expanding further. In the coming months and years, we are likely to see continued fighting, continued diplomacy, and continued uncertainty. Periods of calm may be followed by sudden escalations. Talks may begin, stall, and resume again. This is not the end of the story, but it may be the beginning of its final, longest, and most complex phase. In simple terms, the Russia-Ukraine war in 2026 is not about quick victories or dramatic endings. It is about endurance, pressure, and survival. The endgame, if it comes, will not arrive with a single announcement or a single signature. It will arrive slowly, through a series of decisions, compromises, and realities that neither side fully controls. Until then, the war continues, shaping not only Ukraine and Russia, but the global order itself.